Hello everyone and welcome to A Question of Life and Death. I'm Anneka Rice and today we'll be delving into some of life's biggest questions. Has living through a pandemic changed our relationship with death? Can we overcome our discomfort talking about the end of our lives? And what role can faith play in these challenging and changing times? Well, I'm joined today by a panel of guests whose work brings them face to face with these questions on a daily basis. Dr. Kathryn Mannix is a palliative care doctor and author of 2 best-selling books about end-of-life care, With the End in Mind and Listen, How to Find the Words for Tender Conversations. Jasvir Singh is the chair of City of Sikhs and a regular contributor to BBC Radio 4's Thought for the Day. Rupert Callender is the co-founder of the Green Funeral Company and author of What Remains, Life, Death and the Human Art of Undertaking. And Reverend Cassius Francis is a minister with the Wesleyan Holiness Church and a trainer with the bereavement signposting charity At a Loss. This event is part of a programme of online talks for the National Day of Reflection 2023. Marking 3 years to the date since the UK first went into lockdown, the aim of the National Day of Reflection is to raise awareness of the impact of grief on all of our lives and to highlight the need for better support. Led by Marie Curie and supported by hundreds of community organisations, workplaces and schools, it's a day to remember and celebrate those who've died and to support everyone who's been bereaved. Well, a very warm welcome to all of you. I thought we'd dive right in. So, Kathryn, I'm going to come to you first. It seems to me that we're particularly uncomfortable talking about death in the UK. Is that peculiar to us in the UK?
I think that's a great question.
Are the Europeans better than us? You know, where's it going?
Okay, so I think that perhaps as we get further towards the Mediterranean, there is more of a tradition still of talking about dying. Yeah. Perhaps that also parallels across to the west of Ireland. And it's interesting, isn't it, that we're talking about communities there that have a very strong Roman Catholic tradition to them, even if people are not still adhering to that religious tradition, that the cultural traditions still pertain. But generally, the developed world, the rich economies that have sent dying people to hospital and forgotten about the process of dying,
yes,
have become very uncomfortable and unfamiliar.
Is it sort of that we've medicalised it so much now that we send people off to die?
Yeah,
either in a hospital or a care home or whatever, whereas I suppose traditionally in the communities you're talking about, you might have died at home.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that what's happened over the last 100 years is medicine's become capable of doing so much more, and it's become worth sending people who are so sick that they could die into hospital in the hope that their life could be saved on this occasion, because we haven't cured death yet, obviously. But it means 2 things: that families are no longer gathered around a person who's dying at home, observing the changes and being that person's companions. And it's turned dying from a social event, from a personal, intimate event, into a medical event and even a medical failure. And that's really sad.
And medical failure is a terrible thing to take through for the people who are living afterwards, for the relatives, to feel that in some way their relation has not had a good death. Or I'd like to discuss that a bit later on, this thing of having a good death. But it's very interesting what you say, that as communities we've sort of gone away from caring for our own loved ones. And where do you stand on that, Jasvir? Is that what you see as well?
I think it depends. When you're talking about, say, the South Asian diaspora communities in the UK, or those who have faith communities which belong to a non-Christian tradition, you will see that there are differences when it comes to how death is perceived. And certainly within those faith traditions that have a rich history in India, for example, you would see that death is seen as part of life. It's seen as part of the circle of existence. I think when you're talking about those communities in the UK, again, there are differences. For example, if there is someone who has passed away in India, for example, the cremation will take place very quickly and the body is brought to the home from the mortuary. It's kept in the home for perhaps a day or so. and then the cremation takes place. And the family is very much involved in every single step of that funeral process or death process, for want of a better word. Whereas over in the UK, we have funeral directors, which removes that element of proximity to death, almost.
Yes, I remember when my dad died, and luckily the funeral parlour was just around the corner, and they let me just go in and sit with the coffin. And that was a really lovely bridge for me. Really, nice for me, not so good for him, because obviously he wasn't around anymore. But I just thought I'm lucky that I can do that.
Yes.
And what you're saying in with the stories you've just told us from India, that would be very much part of the process.
It would be.
Yeah.
Yes, it would be part of the process of acceptance of death, because
it's a bridge. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Rue, you're very much for ditch the hearse, bring the kids, have a picnic.
Yes, I suppose that's a kind of shorthand for what I do. I mean, it's interesting what Jasvir says there. I describe myself as an undertaker precisely to kind of separate myself from this idea that there is a funeral, capital F, director, capital D, who just leads you through the etiquette of the British funeral, really. I've been doing it for a couple of decades now, and I've been deliberately trying to limit the distance between us and the family and not act as a gatekeeper, really, and try and make it as inclusive as possible, and possibly much more like the South Asian communities' ways of dealing with it themselves. But I would disagree slightly that we find it difficult to talk about death in this country. My experience is that when people discover I'm an undertaker, they can't wait to talk about death, really, and they're just looking for an excuse to talk about it. It's I don't think it's as taboo in this country anymore as it used to be.
Yes, that's interesting. And what do you think has brought about that change?
Well, in some ways our news feeds are saturated with it, and our television and films, there's a sort of almost a kind of pornography of death that's played out in front of us. And I think when people encounter it for real, and we all do encounter it eventually for real, that they really do actually want to engage with it more and more. But of course, the pandemic has brought it closer to home for everybody, and I think people really want to talk about it much more than they used to. But I've noticed it for 20 years that people have been desperate to talk about death.
Cassius, can I bring you in here, because you must be on the sort of front line of all this?
I tend to agree with some of what Rue was saying in terms of the kind of sea change that we've recognised over the years. I think particularly as Prince Harry started to talk more about the impact of on his mental health with the death of Diana. Also, Rio Ferdinand, the footballer, started to talk about the death of his wife and wrote a really helpful book, I thought, about the process of being a single father as a result of the death. So there has been a change. But we would certainly have described death as a kind of last great taboo. So there is that sense that there's a hesitancy as well about talking about death. But from an African Caribbean perspective, I've come from a tradition of an open casket in the funerals and this recognition that the viewing of the body is important. But also I'm recognising now that that's changing. For younger people coming through, there's a sense of also wanting to distance from death sometimes. So, I think it's a change in picture. But I do agree that the importance of being close to the body is helpful in processing the grief and just coming to terms with the loss of a loved one.
So do you think you're trying to slightly demystify the subject in a way with the people you're dealing with?
Yeah, I think that's critical. And just the recognition that the importance of talking about a loved one and making sure that people are recognising the importance of talking about grief, trying to make sure that mental health problems that could develop if we don't, and we just do this stiff upper lip thing, don't get worse, if you like, or progress to further problems. So I think that idea of demystifying death is really important.
Yeah. Kathryn, you've spent your medical career with people who are who have incurable advanced illnesses, and your book With the End in Mind was your attempt to sort of capture the wisdom of dying and death. Tell us about this wisdom.
Well, I started off by thinking about the things that we're talking about now, that the talking about dying around the time of a person dying or around the time that a person's died is very, very important, and families do it of necessity at that point. But what they don't do is talk about it in advance in a way that teaches children that we're all mortal and that dying is part of living in the way that exactly what you're describing. So the taboo, if there is one, is that we don't want to upset each other by talking about our deaths with the people who matter most to us. So Rue has all this curiosity about being an undertaker. I get lots of curiosity about being a palliative care doctor. But what isn't happening is families are not understanding the actual process that a body goes through, a human person goes through, or in fact any animal goes through as their body is dying. And what I wanted to do is give the wisdom back that my grandmother had, and she had it by seeing it lots and lots of times, you know, being a daughter in a big family, helping to look after family and friends in the early part of the 20th century, and expecting to give that wisdom to her children, to my mum, to my auntie, and that they would then pass it to me. And yet when she was in her 90s, one of the things that worried her was that she didn't think her children had ever seen anybody die.
Oh, well, they probably hadn't.
So a single generation was when that switch happened for us.
Well, it's back to how we started off discussing how it's so medicalised now that the people aren't dying at home in the same way. That's
and yet,
extraordinary.
What we observe at the bedsides of dying people, as the healthcare professionals now, is exactly what families were observing when people were at home. So with the end in mind, my attempt to give the wisdom back is to give people the wisdom the way my grandmother acquired it, through stories, through being present. So it's simply stories of the way people live while they're dying. It's not a technical book, it's not a textbook, and it simply helps people to feel as though they've sat there with somebody and observed what's happened to them, how they've talked about it, how they've dealt with it, and perhaps gives us a few ideas to think, oh, okay, I could probably talk about that with the people who matter most to me.
Does anyone else want to come in on that with the subject of wisdom?
I think the wisdom aspect is obviously important. For me, I'd just take that perhaps a step back, which is to start having discussions with loved ones about how would you want your funeral to be conducted, or when you die, where would you like your ashes scattered? That's a conversation I've had with my parents, and I had it many years ago. But it's helped to normalise the idea of death, because it's this idea of, well, we're all going to die at some point, but we also want to make sure that whatever process we undergo, wherever we end up having our ashes scattered or wherever we're buried, is somewhere that is from our own choosing. It's somewhere where we would feel comfortable, and something that we want to ensure is then carried out once we've passed away. Now, when I speak to other friends of mine, they feel scared to have that conversation. They feel that this isn't a conversation that you should be having with your parents or grandparents, and it's that sense of, I think it comes back to what we were saying earlier about the taboo. There is still a taboo about this, but it's more to do with being scared of when death comes and what happens then. And that by talking about it, you're almost tempting fate to some extent.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, I wonder how much of that is cultural. Because again, I recognise with my own background this sense of, oh, if you're starting to talk about death, what does that mean?
Yes.
Almost as if you are, you're bringing that onto someone. So that can also add to the reluctance about just having those conversations. But I've realised from a perspective of as a minister that it's important, it's critical, that we have those conversations and try and have them as early as possible to, as we said, demystify.
And I mean, a sense of a lightness of touch about it almost in a way. I always remember I was when I was doing the Radio 2 breakfast show at one time, we talked about Carrie Fisher, you know, the actress who died and had her coffin in the shape of a Prozac pill. And I just mentioned it, and whoosh, honestly, the whole programme became dedicated to how people wanted to go, you know, and maybe what their coffin could look like. And it was really a very lovely conversation. I don't mean to trivialise it at all, because it really was quite deep. People really thought about it, and we had them on the phone and, you know, contributing, you know, to the programme as a whole. It was kind of rather wonderful. Rue, do you have those sort of discussions with people? Do they have?
I do. I quite often try and dissuade people from organising their own funerals, because I think that it's up to you know, a funeral is not for you. Your own funeral is not for you. It's for your family. It's about you.
It's an interesting concept,
but it's not for you. So I quite often say, well, just decide what you don't want. Whether, you know, if you don't want to be cremated or you don't want to be buried, tell your family that, but leave a lot of it open, really.
About 10 minutes ago, we mentioned that phrase, a good death. And we often talk, you know, people say, oh, is it a good death? And it seems to me that's sort of divided into two. You know, there's the good death for the person dying, which you pray that's going to be swift and painless. But there's also a kind of good death for the relatives and friends gathering around. I'd love to just hear you talk about that, because there's two things going on there, aren't there?
There absolutely are, and yes, and I think sometimes they can be contradictory, really, because the good death for the family is the one in which they see that the person isn't in pain or making distressing noises and things like that, which you know, obviously this is Kathryn's speciality, but a lot of what might look distressing or sound distressing isn't as distressing as it actually is. And certainly a good death 10, 20 years ago might have meant a sort of overdose of morphine almost, really. It just meant that you couldn't tell anybody was going through any kind of pain. And it's a really fine balancing act. And there's a certain tyranny, I think, in this idea of the good death as well. People have become to expect a good death and think that palliative care has got so brilliantly advanced that it can remove all pain always and all suffering and all distress, and sometimes it can't. And people can feel a bit cheated then and go, well, I thought they were going to have a good death. And,
well, it's back to that word medical, those two words, medical failure, whereas, you know, the relatives can be sort of left with a sort of stain on their memory, really, that it just didn't go as they would have liked it to go. You're nodding there, Cassius.
Yeah, we recently had a relative who died in hospital. We were thankful that she was able to be surrounded by her family for the last week or few days of her life. But there was a recognition on my part, even observing from a distance, that there was a sense of needing to protect some family members from that. Some of the younger family members, you know, well, we don't want them to see grandma in this state. And I think there is an important sense of that reconnection of seeing what death is about, because again, it is the important thing of coming to terms with the loss. You know, so it is, as Ruth says, I think there's the challenges that come with it, but the reality, I think, of death is important to come to terms with.
I'd love to just talk about faith, because, you know, if you're in a hospice and you've got two patients, and one, you know, is religious and believes in some kind of afterlife, and the other is not thinking that's going to be their end, how does that change their outlook? How does that change the way they see that next step?
This has fascinated me for a long time, because I've been observing it for, you know, 30 years or more. And it's uncertainty that destabilises us. People are anxious about uncertainty. So the more a person believes the thing that they believe, whether they're a very faithful Sikh, very faithful Christian, very faithful Jew, a very convinced atheist, they have less uncertainty. They have a real sense that what will happen next is whatever their faith tells them, or that there will be nothing if they're an atheist. And that removes some of that sense of uncertainty about what's going to happen afterwards. The thing that's also really interesting is that there are some faiths that make meaning out of discomfort and suffering and weakness and frailty and those experiences of being unwell. And that's very interesting, watching people of faith see this as something that's being required of them by their deity, or something that's helping to atone for things that they did wrong previously in their life in different religions, or ways of purifying themselves in order to be worthy of the afterlife that they believe in. So it is really, really interesting watching and talking to and listening to people about their faith and their beliefs and how they make sense of things.
So you don't see more fear in the eyes of the atheist?
I think you see more fear in the eyes of the lukewarm, not quite sure, went to an Anglican primary school, but I've never really done much about it since. Because I've heard about heaven and hell, and I'm a little bit worried about that kind of stuff, but I haven't spent a lifetime thinking about it and getting my mind sorted out about what I believe and formulating a belief about it. What we do see, though, is towards the end of people's lives, whether they have a faith or not, they're making sense of what their life has been worth against a set of values that are important to them. So that might be one of the great faiths, but it might be about environmentalism or political belief. It might be about ties of family and things like that. Have I been good enough? Have I lived a life that was worthy? Have I relished it? Have I made the most of the fantastic chance of having been alive? Is a really common thread in people towards the end of their lives.
Rue, do you find with the funerals that you organise or the ceremonies that you organise that faith comes into it to a degree, or is it more environmental if people have chosen you as
It's more social, to be honest. I mean, the environmental aspect to the funerals that we've always done has always just been common sense to me, you know, as few chemicals as possible and coffins that are as good as possible for the environment. But and generally, I do religious funerals. I live in Devon, so that it's quite lacking in multiculturalism. The religious funerals that I do are Christian, but generally I do secular funerals. So really, we're kind of reinventing the wheel each time. This is why I kind of try to encourage people not necessarily to over-organise their funeral. If you have an established faith and you have a kind of a series of steps that you know are going to happen, it's quite easy. But if you have no faith, there is a tremendous amount of work that can be done for the family, which will benefit them for years to come in going, okay, this person has now died, we have to either burn them or bury them, but how we get there without the structure of a faith is entirely up to us. And so my approach has always been collaborative. The religious funerals that I do are remarkably simple and straightforward for me, really. Right. They follow a pattern and they're great. And the funerals that I've done for where everybody absolutely believes is I'm very envious, really. Okay. But to take it out to non-religious people and go, what ritual are we going to create here is challenging but enormously rewarding.
And Jasvir, obviously, as a Sikh, do you have many Sikhs on the fence, or does everyone, in your experience, as they near death, they know what the next path is for them?
So for Sikhs and Hindus and Jains and other faith traditions from that part of the world, there's a similar understanding, which is that the human life is the last life in a great circle of lives that one has to go through. It's estimated to be 8.4 million lives from an amoeba all the way through to a human life. And the human life is the last one before we have the opportunity of, as within the Buddhist tradition, of gaining nirvana, which in the Sikh in the Sikh faith means becoming one with the universe, becoming one with the divine. However, not all Sikhs have that understanding. And I think it comes down to the ways in which people practice their faiths as opposed to what the faith tradition says. those who are fully aware of the faith tradition may find themselves far more comforted by what the faith has to say. Those who come from a faith traditional family but haven't necessarily engaged with the faith themselves to the same way that their parents or grandparents may have, they're the ones who may perhaps be sitting on the fence because they have less of an understanding of what happens when we die if we're of this faith. Where do we go? What happens to our soul? Do we have a soul? What happens to our body? Are we reborn? Is it reincarnation? Or is it that idea of you've come to the end of the line of those 8.4 million lives? So for them, it's perhaps more problematic. And you'll find that those are the more likely to be the younger generations, those who haven't had as much of an opportunity, one could argue, to engage in their faiths in the same way that perhaps their parents, grandparents and great-grandparents did.
That's interesting. Okay, so it's a generational thing almost. The younger generation are coming through with more questions?
Yes.
Is that fair to say?
More questions about their faith and more questions about how that then impacts on their deaths, I guess.
Talking of impact there, I'd love to just bring in the pandemic, because obviously the National Day of Reflection is looking back from those 3 years when the pandemic started. And, you know, we went from being a society where we seldom talked about death to suddenly having death in front of us on the news. You know, it was all we could talk about. It was that sort of daily death toll and what was going on. Cassius, how did that affect your work in the church? You know, because suddenly death is the main subject, whereas possibly 3 weeks before it hadn't been.
Yeah, great question. I think impacts on a number of levels. So as you mentioned in the introduction, I'm a minister with the Wesleyan Holiness Church, relatively small black majority denomination. Over the course of the pandemic, 3 of our ministers died. So in a church of 300 members nationally, 3 of our ministers out of 12 churches is massive. Not all of them COVID related. But speaking to ministers around the country, there's been a recognition of just the multiple deaths and the impact of deaths throughout the pandemic, and particularly the recognition that it wasn't an even playing field, which we now know. Particular communities harder hit. And so, yeah, there was, I think there's a sense for me of just the unresolved trauma for a lot of families who haven't fully been able to process the death of their loved ones, not been able to have the funeral that they may have wanted, might have had to restrict numbers, all kinds of complications that might have come into that through the pandemic. So on a number of levels, just the recognition that the support needed is ongoing. Even though we feel that the pandemic is done and gone and we can move on from that, the impact is lasting.
I think one of the most difficult aspects of having a close family member or loved one dying during the pandemic was the restrictions on funerals, was the restriction on being able to socialise with one's family, one's friends, when that person had passed. In many traditions, the fact that you are then surrounded by what would traditionally have been a village of people coming together, of bringing food or cooking with you or sitting with you, just talking about memories, just spending that time together. All of that disappeared for that period of time. And the impact of that cannot be underestimated. I have family members who are still grieving the loss of their partners, for example. And it's almost like there hasn't been this closure that there would normally have been during times when you are able to meet and have family and friends together. And it's that open-endedness of not being able to say goodbye in the way that you would have hoped, which really hurts people, continuing to this day.
I think that's right. And I think the other thing is that because people weren't able to visit dying people, we haven't been able to construct the story of the last days and weeks of a person's life either. And those stories are the stories that we tell ourselves in bereavement as part of the consolation. You know, the last time they sat up, the last thing they had to eat, the last funny thing that they said. We haven't had the consolation of being their bedside companions. And then we couldn't get together to mourn either. So one of the things I think we're starting to learn is that bereavement is not an event. It's not a thing that happens and you get better from it. 3 years on, bereaved people are still bereaved. And that's because they will always be bereaved. And what will happen is they'll spend the rest of their lives learning to live a different way with that loss, learning to relate to the person they loved in a different way. We don't stop loving them, do we? Love doesn't go into the past tense when a person dies. So maybe one of the if I use the word gifts, it sounds trivialising and I don't mean it to, but something we can take from what has happened to us all, the brutalising thing that's happened to us all, is for us to be more tender with each other in recognising bereavement as a lifelong journey and to be each other's companions in it.
Do you think there's a sort of way people can now come together to mourn in a meaningful way that sort of represents all faiths? Do you think we're anywhere near that, or is it still sort of very regimented?
Well, I think, again, I think that's, I hesitate at using the word gift, but I think that might be an opportunity that could come out of COVID. And with the memorial wall, there are huge opportunities to share cross-culturally and cross-community in our grief and our loss. Because, yes, all sorts of, it was an unlevel playing field, and more communities were desperately affected more than others. But nobody escaped escaped it completely, and I think there's an enormous opportunity to get together as a nation and to create some sort of shared grief ritual.
I suppose we're all grasping for anything that gives us comfort at that very vulnerable time. I'm not talking about the person dying. I'm talking about the person living around them.
Yes,
you know, you're sort of desperately clinging on to anything that makes sense of it all.
Yes, absolutely. I think, but you know, as I say, the funerals I deal with are largely secular, largely atheist, and I think I completely agree with Kathryn that the narrative that's constructed around how somebody dies is incredibly useful to people who don't have a faith, really, but just to continue that story of love. And yes, when you talked about closure, Jasvir, in a social sense, I completely understand it, but in a bereavement sense, I think it's a terrible term, because there is no end to losses. There is no getting over it. If you love somebody and they die, you live with that for the whole of your life. And as Kathryn says, you just learn to adjust and live with it. But there's never any closure for losing someone you love.
Can we introduce any positivity into this subject for people listening or watching who have been through a terrible, terrible time? We've talked about how bereavement is an ongoing process. Is that process itself might be a nurturing thing sometimes? Kathryn, can you?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's becoming more clear is that there have been all sorts of models of grief and bereavement, but perhaps the most useful one is the model they call continuing bonds, which is exactly what it says on the tin, that we find a way of continuing that precious relationship with the person who's died. And people do that in a variety of ways. Some people visit graves, and some people plant a tree or put a bench somewhere that was special to a person, and it's a place that they will go. They'll think about that person. What a lot of them don't tell each other, but they secretly tell people who aren't related to them, is that they chat to their dead people. Lots and lots of people chat to their dead people, and they find that immensely comforting.
Yes.
And they very often can listen and think, oh, I know exactly what they would have said, or perhaps even hear the voice in their mind of what the person would have said. So although bereavement leaves us desolate at the very beginning, that continuing of the bonds and growing on of the love in a different way is a really important part of the way we process bereavement. And 3 years out, there will be people now who are starting to find those things in their lives as well, the moments of joy that they can remember without the pang of sorrow that makes it too hard to remember.
Yeah.
To have the conversation, to use the person's name, and for the people who support us when we're bereaved, please say the person's name.
Yes,
We haven't forgotten. We haven't forgotten for a moment that our beloved person died. But if you tell us that you were thinking about them the other day, we know you haven't forgotten either, and it's wonderful.
Yeah. So there's some comfort there for people watching and thinking, I'm still down at the bottom of that well.
I think, you know, hope is something that we talk about from a Christian perspective, but I talk to my nan daily. She died in 2021. There's a recognition for me that understanding more about the grief process now helps me to recognise that I'm not going mad because I'm doing that. And it's not counter to my faith, the fact that I'm doing that as well. But just helping people to recognise, I think, as you said, those continuing bonds, saying the name of the individual, you know, looking at pictures, laughing and recognising that sometimes you will be crying the next minute and may not understand why, is just part of bereavement.
Yes.
And I think the more that we are able to just educate and raise awareness about what bereavement is like, helps again to demystify some of
I think being able, you know, keeping that person's name alive is so important, isn't it? You know, they're still part of your family. And, you know, name checks, I think you were just saying just now, you know, that's just so important.
It's hugely important.
You know, they're still sort of sitting at the table in their own way. All those things are really important, I think. If you could all think of some kind of utopian future, you know, what could our society look like in, say, 50 years' time if we became more comfortable with death?
Well, I think hospices in every town, for a start, would be a wonderful thing. And I think a reversal of this atomisation of our generations, I think trying to bring the elderly of our nation back out of the ghettos and into the family home would really work. But I also see crematoriums as potential secular temples in waiting, really. And I would like to see them redesigned. I think at the moment the design of most of them and the time slots are still stuck in a very old framework, 20 minutes, half an hour to celebrate a life in a really austere-looking building, whereas they could be these incredible multi-faith or no-faith places which you could actually have a really meaningful experience and really become a community experience, not just something that you endure, but something that you actually go to together and do together and experience something meaningful, whether you have faith or not.
So for me, it would be having a change in the way that we talk about death and being able to do so, as you said earlier, with a lightness of touch, being able to bring, and without being too insensitive about it, being able to bring a sense of levity to it and being able to talk about it, being able to talk about loved ones, but be able to share those happy memories and know that, yes, you know, there may be tears along the way, but it's fine to talk. That's one of the important things. And I think we as a nation sometimes forget that we should be more willing to talk about matters such as death. I think COVID has helped. I think that's moved the conversation on. And the COVID Memorial Wall is a magnificent piece of art.
Absolutely.
When you go there, you see the names of people from all different backgrounds. You see so many different religious symbols which have been etched into each of the hearts. So, you know, being able to talk about death in a way in which that perhaps we were able to between the First and Second World Wars. You know, being able to have that sense of these are the people, these are our loved ones who have died. We need to be able to talk about them, but remember them with love and happiness, but at the same time, be able to share those memories with all and sundry without feeling as though we're necessarily talking about something we shouldn't be.
Lovely. Kathryn, your utopian future, 50 years' time.
I would love, in 50 years' time, that understanding the process of ordinary human dying is in the national curriculum. that children understand it from being very small, that they come home and talk to their families about it, that it's demystified, that it's anticipated, and that takes a lot of the fear away. We can't make it not be sad, but if we're not afraid, then we can do our preparing and live amongst each other in the presence of it so much more gracefully.
I did a lovely chat with Dame Sue Black, who's a forensic expert. You know, she loves bones and bodies and everything, and she's decided to make her body, her bones, into a skeleton. You know, for
a classroom.
For a classroom, and she's to get her kids involved with it, and grandkids, and it's sort of it'll become Granny's skeleton, and I just love that.
Because children are curious.
Yes.
And
so they talk about it so much at the moment that they're almost willing the death. We want the skeleton now.
But that's interesting, isn't it? Because it's a really good illustration of how it's grown-ups being fearful of talking about dying in front of children that communicates with children that this is not a good thing to talk about. So we need to tip that on its head. And in 50 years' time, that generation will be the elders, and we will be a death-aware society again in the way that we were 100 years ago.
That's positive. Cassius.
Yeah, I love that distinction between sadness and being frightened, and the place of lament within the Christian tradition. I think it's really important, the recognition that we need to be sad sometimes. That's just part of life. But that distinction between sadness and being frightened, I think, is critical. I mean, we'd support certainly the national curriculum taking on board issues around death and bereavement. I think that would help us to change some of the conversations and, as we've said, demystify death and help children also to come to terms with, what it means when someone dies. And I think 50 years' time, my goodness, I would love to see that there is just the bereavement support that's needed available for people at the time when they need it. The recognition is at the moment that for so many, at that point when they've reached that time, feeling vulnerable, they reach out for help and may have to wait weeks, months before they're able to access the support that they need. And I think that having that support readily available would make a huge difference.
And I guess it's just looking at death as just another experience.
Yeah.
In your religion, Jasvir, the soul is being released. It's this beginning of something kind of wonderful.
Absolutely. So at the end of that 8.4 million lives, the human life is the last one. And so when someone passes, Sikhs are taught not to be, obviously we're going to be upset and sad, but we also need to remember that that person has started a new journey, that person is, one would hope, about to embark upon their journey to become one with the divine, to become part of the divine almost. And Sikhs, when someone passes, the traditional thing for Sikhs to say is that we hope the Almighty, we hope the divine gives you the strength to accept their will, because the person who has passed has gone on. They have moved on. The body is left behind. It's an empty vessel. There's that is now, those are the remains. That is what needs to be cremated, buried as appropriate. But it's the idea that the soul has moved on to somewhere else, and the soul is, to all extents and purposes, a better place.
And that's a lovely sort of image, isn't it, for anyone of any religion or non-religion. I'm not a religious person, but I love the thought of a soul. That a soul is something that lives outside your body somehow. Yes. I always feel that. You're nodding, Ruth.
Well, I was thinking, I'm also not a person of faith, but what working with the dead and the bereaved for 23 years has given me is an enormous faith in human nature. The courage of ordinary people and the love that ordinary people show is just, it's a breathtaking honour to be around, really. But I also, agree with what Cassius is saying, and I think it links in with what we started talking about with, really, that I don't necessarily think it's death that's taboo. I think it's grief that's taboo in our society, and I think people have a very visceral response to grief, and we need to overcome our own fear of being contaminated by other people's grief and embrace people.
Yes. It was very interesting when the Queen passed away, wasn't it? I mean, I had a very visceral reaction to that. I think it gave people an opportunity to feel grief. Wow. Well, thank you all very much indeed. There's a lot of food for thought there, but I think on the whole we've come to the conclusion that I like the end thought that we mustn't be frightened of death in any way. That's an adventure or an experience. It's grief we've got to get better at. But at the end of the day, love is what we've got to get really good at.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That is all we have time for today. Huge thanks to my guests, Dr. Kathryn Mannix, Jasvir Singh, Reverend Cassius Francis and Rupert Callender, or Rue Callender. This talk is part of a programme of online events for the National Day of Reflection 2023. And if you or someone you care about is grieving, the Marie Curie support line is here for you. You can call 0800 090 2309 for practical and emotional support, whatever your situation, or just search for Marie Curie bereavement to find out more. Stay tuned for the Grief Toolkit at 5, when Julia Samuel and Kathryn Mannix will share their most effective tools and practices for coping with grief.